Every night, something extraordinary happens to you. Your consciousness disappears. For hours, the entity reading these words ceases to exist in any meaningful, experiential sense. There is no you in deep sleep, no observer, no witness, no subject. The lights of awareness that you have come to identify as yourself simply go out. Your brain remains, of course, doing things, but the someone who experiences being you is, by every measurement neuroscience can make, gone. And then something even stranger happens. You wake up, and without hesitation, without question, without any need for verification, you assume that the person opening these eyes is the same person who closed them. You pick up your thoughts where you left them. You remember your name, your fears, your unfinished arguments. You feel the continuity of being yourself with such absolute certainty that the question of whether it is true never arises. But the brain that wakes up is not the brain that went to sleep. During those hours of darkness, billions of synaptic connections were pruned, weakened, or strengthened. Vast quantities of metabolic waste were flushed from neural tissue through a system that opens only during sleep. Memories were consolidated, recategorized, sometimes rewritten. Proteins were synthesized at rates impossible during waking. Electrical patterns coursed across your cortex in waves so distinct from waking activity that neuroscientists give them entirely different names. By morning, in measurable physical terms, the substrate of your selfhood has been reconstructed, and yet you wake up certain you are you. This certainty is the most remarkable, the most unexamined, and perhaps the most fragile assumption of human existence. Today we begin to examine it. What we will find is that the simple, daily, universal experience of falling asleep and waking up is, when looked at closely, one of the strangest facts about being a human being. It is also a fact that touches on the deepest questions of consciousness, identity, memory, and what it means to exist as a continuous being across time. It is a fact that ancient contemplatives noticed and wrote about thousands of years ago, and that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm with measurement. The simple act of going to sleep and waking up is, in ways most people never consider, a daily disappearance and reappearance of the self. The first thing that must be understood is that sleep is not a single state. It is a sequence of distinct states, each with its own neural signature, its own chemistry, its own relationship to consciousness. The framework neuroscientists use today goes back to the 1950s, when Eugene Aserinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago discovered rapid eye movements during certain phases of sleep, and to the work of William Demant and Michel Jouvet, who mapped the architecture of these phases in the years that followed. A typical night cycles through these states roughly every 90 minutes. There are stages of light, non-REM sleep, stages of deep, slow-wave sleep, and stages of REM sleep where the brain becomes nearly as active as in waking. But the most philosophically arresting phase is what neuroscientists call N3, or slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, where the cortex generates large, slow oscillations at less than 1 cycle per second. In this state, something happens to consciousness that has no parallel anywhere else in human experience. It vanishes, not into a dream, not into a different kind of awareness. It simply ceases. Researchers have demonstrated this through painstaking experiments. When subjects are awakened from REM sleep, they almost always report having been experiencing something, a dream, a fragment, an image, an emotion. When they are awakened from light non-REM sleep, they sometimes report fragmentary experience. But when they are awakened from deep N3 slow-wave sleep, they typically report nothing at all. Not darkness, not silence, not the absence of experience as a felt absence, just a gap, a discontinuity, as if the previous moment of awareness had connected directly to the present one, with no time intervening. Giulio Tononi, the neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who developed integrated information theory, has spent decades studying what he has called the disappearance of consciousness in deep sleep. His measurements suggest that during slow-wave sleep, the brain's capacity to integrate information, which his theory identifies with consciousness itself, drops dramatically. The cortex remains active, neurons fire, networks process. But the unified, integrated, coherent something it is like to be that defines waking experience evaporates. This is not a minor curiosity. This is not a technicality. This is the most profound fact about who you are that you almost never consider. Every single night of your life, the thing you call yourself, the continuous experiential subject that watches your thoughts, feels your feelings, makes your choices, simply stops existing. For hours. Without warning, without preparation, without any felt sense of cessation, and then it returns. And the returning self assumes, with no evidence whatsoever, that it is the self that disappeared. The philosopher Galen Strawson at the University of Texas has argued that what we call the self may not be a single continuous thing at all, but a series of momentary selves, each lasting perhaps a few seconds, each replaced by the next, so seamlessly that the illusion of continuity is created. Whether or not he is right about waking life, sleep makes his point with brutal clarity. There is no continuous self crossing the gulf of deep sleep. There cannot be. The substrate that supported the self yesterday is not the same substrate that supports it today, and during the gap between them, the self in any meaningful sense was simply not there. How does the morning self know it is the same self as last night's? It does not know. It assumes. It infers. It reconstructs. And the basis of that reconstruction is something far more fragile, far more recent in its scientific understanding than most people realize. The basis is memory, and memory, as we are about to see, is not what people think it is. To understand how radically the brain changes overnight, we have to look at three distinct processes that unfold during sleep, each of which is a recent discovery, and each of which alters the physical machinery of selfhood in ways that would have been considered impossible a generation ago. The first is synaptic homeostasis. This is the work of Giulio Tononi and Chiara Cirelli, also at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, beginning in the early 2000s. Their hypothesis, supported by a long chain of experimental evidence, is that during waking hours, learning and experience cause synapses, the connections between neurons, to strengthen. New experiences require new connections. Familiar experiences reinforce existing ones. By the end of a day of waking activity, the cortex is, in their phrase, saturated with potentiated synapses. The brain has become metabolically expensive, energetically inefficient, and increasingly noisy. There is too much signal, too many connections firing too easily. Cognition begins to degrade. Sleep, in their model, performs a critical function. It weakens synapses globally, restoring balance, preserving the relative strengths that encode meaningful information while attenuating the absolute level. Some synapses are pruned entirely, others are weakened. The connectome that emerges from sleep is, in measurable terms, a different connectome from the one that entered it. By morning, you have, in a literal physical sense, fewer connections than you had at bedtime. The cortex has been pared back. And yet, paradoxically, your memories are clearer, your thinking sharper, your access to learned skills enhanced. The pruning is not loss. The pruning is refinement. The brain that wakes up is a leaner, more efficient version of the brain that fell asleep. But it is also, in a sense that matters, a different brain. The second process is the glymphatic system, discovered by Maiken Nedergaard at the University of Rochester in 2013. This was a revolution in understanding the brain. Until that point, neuroscientists believed the brain lacked the lymphatic drainage system that clears metabolic waste from the rest of the body. Nedergaard's team discovered that the brain has its own clearance system, but that it operates almost exclusively during sleep. During slow-wave sleep, the channels between brain cells expand by approximately 60%. Cerebrospinal fluid flows through these expanded spaces, washing out the molecular debris of the day's neural activity. Among the substances cleared during this process are beta-amyloid proteins, the same proteins that accumulate in Alzheimer's disease. In other words, every night, your brain is physically scrubbed in a way it cannot be during the day. The molecular composition of your neural tissue is different in the morning from what it was the night before. Toxic byproducts of neural activity that would, accumulated over weeks, produce cognitive impairment have been removed. The brain that wakes up is, chemically, a cleaner brain. The third process is memory consolidation. This is the longer, deeper story, and it is the one that most directly threatens our intuitive sense of who we are. The work of Robert Stickgold at Harvard Medical School, building on decades of earlier research from Eric Kandel at Columbia University and others, has shown that memories are not stored statically in the brain. They are not files saved to a hard drive. They are dynamic, reconstructive, malleable patterns that are reshaped each night by sleep. During sleep, the hippocampus, the temporary memory structure, deep in the temporal lobe, replays the day's experiences to the cortex, where they are gradually integrated into long-term storage. This process is called systems consolidation, and it can take days, weeks, or in some cases years to complete for a single memory. But here is what makes consolidation philosophically explosive. The memory that emerges from this process is not the same as the memory that entered it. Each night, every memory that is reactivated is also potentially altered. Connections to other memories are formed. Emotional content is regulated, often dampened. Inconsistencies with newer information are smoothed out. Details are blurred or sharpened, depending on their relevance. By the time a memory has been consolidated, it has been edited, sometimes profoundly, from whatever original experience produced it. Karim Nader, working at McGill University in 2000, demonstrated something even more striking. When a memory is recalled, it must be reconsolidated to remain stable. During this reconsolidation window, the memory is malleable. It can be altered by new information, by current emotional state, by suggestion, by the very act of recalling it. Each time you remember something, you are not retrieving a record, you are reconstructing a pattern, and the reconstruction can change what is later remembered. Consider what this means for the morning self. The morning self knows itself by remembering. It knows it is the same person who fell asleep last night because it remembers falling asleep. It knows it has the relationships, the fears, the goals, the history that it does, because it remembers them. But these memories are not stable records, they have been edited overnight. The morning self believes it is continuous with the night self, because it has memories that suggest continuity. But the memories themselves are products of a process that occurred during the gap. Eric Kandel, whose work established the molecular basis of memory and earned him the Nobel Prize in 2000, once wrote that, "We are who we are because of what we learn and what we remember." If this is true, and the molecular evidence suggests that it is, then we are who we are because of a process that happens largely while no one is home. The self that wakes up is a self that has been built, partially, by mechanisms that operate in the absence of selfhood. What, then, is the thread that connects yesterday's self to today's? If consciousness vanishes in deep sleep, if synapses are pruned, if cerebrospinal fluid washes through the brain, if memories are reconstructed and edited, what remains constant? The answer is more fragile than most people are prepared to accept. What remains constant is mostly information, patterns, configurations, the specific weights of remaining synapses, the specific arrangement of consolidated memories, the body, certainly, in approximate continuity, but not consciousness, not the experiencing subject, that has been absent for hours and has now reassembled itself from the surviving information. This raises a question that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries, but that neuroscience has now made impossible to avoid. The question is the question of personal identity. What makes you the same person you were yesterday? John Locke, writing in the 17th century, proposed what came to be called the memory criterion. You are the same person across time, Locke argued, because you remember being that person. The continuity of memory is the continuity of self. This view dominated philosophical thinking for centuries, but it has a problem that becomes acute in light of modern neuroscience. Memory is not what Locke thought it was. Memory is reconstructive. Memory is editable. Memory can be implanted, altered, corrupted, and lost. If memory is the foundation of personal identity, that foundation is shifting sand. Derek Parfit, the Oxford philosopher whose 1984 book Reasons and Persons changed the philosophical landscape on this question, pushed the implications of these problems further than anyone before him. Parfit argued that personal identity, in the strict sense most people believe in, simply does not exist. There is no fact of the matter, he argued, about whether the person waking up tomorrow is the same person as the one falling asleep tonight. There are only patterns of psychological continuity, more or less strong, more or less complete. What we call the self is a useful fiction, a convenient label for a chain of psychologically connected experiences that has no metaphysical depth. Parfit considered this conclusion liberating rather than terrifying. If there is no persistent self that needs protecting, there is also no persistent self that needs to fear death. Death becomes simply the discontinuation of a pattern. The same pattern, in a weaker form, is discontinued every night. We have, in this sense, been dying every night of our lives and never noticed. David Hume, more than 2 centuries before Parfit, had reached a similar conclusion through pure introspection. "Whenever I look for the self," Hume wrote, "I never catch myself without a perception. I find feelings, thoughts, sensations, memories, but never a thing called the self that has them. The self appears to be nothing more than a bundle of perceptions." Hume called this the bundle theory, and he found it unsettling enough that he set the question aside as one philosophy could not resolve. Modern neuroscience has not exactly confirmed the bundle theory, but it has made its alternatives harder and harder to defend. Searches for a neural correlate of the unified self have come up empty. There is no central self region in the brain. There is no Cartesian theatre where the inner observer sits. There are only networks, each contributing to one or another aspect of what we experience as selfhood, none of them identifiable as the self itself. And every night, these networks dissolve and reform. Not entirely. The information they encode mostly persists in the synaptic weights and the memory consolidations. But the dynamic process of being a self, the active, ongoing integration that gives rise to felt experience, stops and starts and stops and starts every 24 hours. The morning self does not feel any of this. It feels continuous. It feels singular. It feels like the same self it has always been. And it is partly right. The information has continuity. The body has continuity. The patterns have continuity. But the witness, the experiencer, the subject, this is reconstituted from material every morning. The self is not a thing. The self is an event. And the event happens fresh, in some sense, every time you wake up. If this all sounds abstract, the experiments that ground it are anything but. Consider the work of Robert Stickgold's lab at Harvard Medical School over the past 2 decades. Stickgold and colleagues have shown, in study after study, that learning is not complete when waking experience ends. It continues during sleep. People who learn a complex perceptual task and then sleep on it perform better the next day than people who train for the same amount of time and stay awake. The improvement is not from rest alone. It is from sleep specifically, and especially from the slow wave and REM phases. The brain, while consciousness is absent, is finishing the work that consciousness began. What this means is striking. The skills you wake up with are not the skills you went to sleep with. They have been refined, automated, integrated. The pianist who practices before sleep wakes up a slightly better pianist. The student who studies before sleep wakes up with stronger memories. The consolidation that happens overnight is not passive maintenance. It is active, reshaping. Matthew Walker, the sleep researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, has documented similar effects across many domains. In one striking series of studies, his team showed that REM sleep specifically performs an emotional regulation function. Memories that enter sleep with strong emotional charge often emerge with the charge attenuated. The factual content remains, the autobiographical detail remains, but the visceral force, the sting, has been blunted. Walker has called this overnight therapy. The emotional landscape of the morning self is, on average, less raw than the emotional landscape of the night self. The morning self, in this specific way, is calmer, more regulated, more functional. And it has been made so by processes that operated entirely outside of awareness. There is something almost tender in this picture. While you were absent, while the experiencer was nowhere, the brain continued working on your behalf. It carried forward the unfinished business of the day. It softened what needed softening. It filed away what needed filing. It returned you to yourself in better shape than it received you. In another line of research, this one going back to Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University and continuing in many laboratories, sleep has been shown to perform a structural function on dendrites, the branching extensions of neurons that receive synaptic input. During sleep, certain dendrites are pruned, new ones grow. The morphology of the cortex changes in ways visible under microscopy. Wendy Suzuki at New York University and others have documented neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus, with sleep playing a regulatory role in this process as well. The brain is not a finished structure during adult life. It is a continually rebuilding one, and much of the rebuilding happens at night. Even more provocative are studies on what happens when sleep is disrupted. The work of Eve Van Coulter at the University of Chicago has shown that even short-term sleep deprivation causes measurable changes in glucose metabolism, hormonal balance, and immune function. Long-term deprivation produces changes that approach disease states. It is as if, without the nightly reconstruction, the self begins to come apart at the molecular level. The body and brain depend on the gap of unconsciousness for their continued functioning as a body and brain capable of supporting a self. Take away the gap, and the substrate degrades. Take away enough nights of the gap, and the substrate cannot hold a coherent self at all. There is one experiment that perhaps captures the strangeness of all this most poignantly. In 2017, a team led by Yuval Nir, working in Tononi's lab and at Tel Aviv University, recorded directly from the brains of patients undergoing surgery for epilepsy as they fell asleep. The patients had electrodes implanted for clinical reasons, allowing the researchers to track activity at the level of individual neurons. What they saw was the gradual breakdown of the cortex's capacity for integrated communication. As the patients drifted into deep sleep, the brain regions that had been talking to each other stopped. They continued to fire, but the long-range coordination that defines waking awareness ceased. It was as if the orchestra was still playing, but each section had stopped listening to the others. This decoupling, Tononi argues, is what consciousness fading actually is at the physical level. Not silence, not stillness, but the loss of integration. And when the patients woke up, the integration returned, the long-range communication resumed, the orchestra began listening to itself again, and the self, having been absent in any unified sense, was present once more. The patients did not feel any of this. Of course they did not. There was no one there to feel it. The feeling self was, by definition, the thing that was missing. They went to sleep, and then they woke up, and to them it felt as though no time had passed and nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The very physics of their selfhood had been suspended and restored. The unified self that opened their eyes in the morning was not a continuation of the unified self that had closed them. It was a new instantiation of a similar pattern, drawing on persistent information stored in the rebuilt substrate. The continuity they felt was, in the strict scientific sense, a story their reconstructed minds were telling them. This is where the question becomes existentially serious, because sleep does not just illustrate the philosophical problem of personal identity, it instantiates it, every night, in every human life. And it forces a question that the philosopher David Chalmers, at New York University and the Australian National University, has called the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers' formulation, in 1995, distinguished between the easy problems of consciousness, how the brain processes information, integrates inputs, generates behavior, and the hard problem, which is why any of this is accompanied by experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does information processing generate, somehow, an inner life? Sleep makes the hard problem tangible. During deep, slow-wave sleep, the same brain that supports your inner life when awake supports nothing inner at all. Information is still being processed. Memories are being consolidated. Synapses are being adjusted. But there is no experiencer, no subject, no inside. Then hours later, the inside reappears. The experiencer returns. The lights come on. What turns the lights on? This is not a question neuroscience has answered. It is a question that, in a deep sense, neuroscience does not yet know how to ask. There are theories. Tononi's integrated information theory proposes that consciousness corresponds to the level of integrated information in a system, and that during deep sleep this integration drops below the threshold required for experience. Bernard Baars at the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego proposed global workspace theory, which sees consciousness as the broadcast of information to a wide range of cognitive systems, a kind of central stage where contents become available for thought and action. Stanislas Dehaene, at the Collège de France, has refined this into global neuronal workspace theory, identifying specific neural signatures of conscious access. Each of these theories captures something. None of them tells us why a system organized this way should feel like anything from the inside. The honest acknowledgement is that consciousness, the central feature of every human life, is not understood. It is studied, measured, correlated with neural activity, modeled mathematically, but the bridge from physical process to felt experience has not been built, and every night, every one of us crosses that bridge in both directions, with no awareness of the crossing, with no memory of the gap, with no sense that anything strange has occurred. This is what makes the morning self-certainty so philosophically peculiar. The morning self awakens and immediately feels itself to be a continuous, persistent, unified being. It does not question this. It does not need to. The certainty is built into the experience itself, but the certainty is not based on evidence. The morning self has no direct knowledge of having existed during the gap. It only has memories that suggest continuity, and the memories themselves are products of processes that occurred during the gap. The certainty is an artifact of the very mechanism whose operation we are trying to understand. This is also what makes sleep, in the eyes of many ancient traditions, a teacher. Long before any of these neurological discoveries, contemplatives across cultures noticed something strange about sleep. They noticed that whatever the self was, it was not what it claimed to be in waking life. They noticed that something happens in deep sleep that resembles, in certain respects, what they understood to happen at death. And they wondered whether the self that wakes up each morning is the same self that fell asleep, or whether the assumption of sameness is the most basic of all human errors. The Apostle Paul, writing in the 1st century, said in his first letter to the Corinthians, "I die daily." He meant something theological, but the phrase has resonance now that it could not have had before. The Upanishads, the foundational texts of Vedantic Hinduism composed beginning around 800 BCE, devoted entire passages to the philosophical analysis of deep sleep, distinguishing it from waking and from dream as a distinct state of being called sushupti, and pointing beyond it to a fourth state called turiya. The Buddhist tradition, in its analysis of the absence of an enduring self, returns again and again to the example of sleep as a clue to the nature of selfhood. These traditions did not have neuroscience. They had attention, and what they noticed when they paid attention is what neuroscience is now confirming through measurement. So we are left, at the end of this first inquiry, with a fact that should be far more disturbing than it feels. Every night, you cease to exist as an experiencing subject. Every morning, you reappear, drawing on information stored in a substrate that has been remodeled while you were absent. The continuity you feel is constructed. The memories that bind you to your past have been edited overnight. The brain that opens your eyes is, in measurable physical terms, not the brain that closed them. And yet you wake up convinced you are you. The conviction is so strong that it survives confrontation with the evidence. You can read about synaptic homeostasis. You can read about glymphatic clearing. You can read about memory reconsolidation. You can understand intellectually that the self is reconstructed each morning. And tomorrow, when you wake up, you will feel exactly the same as always. The conviction of continuous selfhood is not a belief. It is a feature of the very mechanism of conscious experience. It cannot be overridden by argument, because it is not produced by argument. This is the situation that the inquiries to come will probe more deeply. We will ask, in physics terms, what it actually means for a complex system to lack an observer for hours and then reacquire one. We will ask whether there is anything in the structure of reality at the quantum level that maps onto the strange disappearances and reappearances of consciousness. We will explore questions about decoherence and integration, about the relationship between information and experience, about whether what we call the self is anything more than a particular kind of pattern that the universe happens to organize itself into for short periods at a time. We will then turn to the contemplative traditions that thought about these questions long before any laboratory could measure them. The Vedantic teachers who classified deep sleep as a distinct state of consciousness and pointed beyond it to a deeper layer of being. The Buddhist analyses of the no-self that found in sleep a daily demonstration of the illusion of continuous identity. The Christian mystics who saw in sleep a kind of daily death, a foreshadowing of the death and resurrection that defined their tradition. The Daoist contemplatives, the Sufi practitioners, the Jewish Kabbalists, each in their own way noticed something about sleep that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to articulate. The traditions found, in the universal human experience of nightly cessation, a clue to the nature of being itself. And then, in the final synthesis, we will return to where we began, to the morning, to the moment of awakening, to the simplest, most universal, most overlooked event in human life. And we will ask what it means, given everything we have come to understand, that you wake up, because the question is not academic. The question is the most personal question you can ask. Who is the one who opens these eyes each day? What is the relationship between that one and the one who closed them? When you say I, What exactly are you referring to? The body has continuity. The information has continuity. The pattern has continuity. But the experiencer, the witness whose existence is the entire fact of your being, came into existence this morning and will go out of existence again tonight and will come into existence again tomorrow, and you have lived through this cycle thousands of times without once examining it. The tradition said that the question of who we are cannot be answered until we look squarely at what happens when we sleep. The neuroscientists, in their own language, are now saying something similar. The most revealing fact about consciousness is that it disappears every night and reappears every morning. The most revealing fact about the self is that it does not exist for hours at a time, and then it does, and you do not notice the seam. The person who wakes up is not the person who went to sleep. What this actually means, we are only beginning to understand. Tonight, when you close your eyes, you will be performing the most ordinary action of human life. You will also be performing one of its most extraordinary. You will be ending, in any meaningful experiential sense, your existence as a conscious being. For hours, there will be no you. The body that lies on the bed will continue to live. The brain that lives inside the skull will continue to do its work. But the thing that knows itself as you, that thinks of itself as you, that walks through the world calling itself you, will not be there. And then, in the morning, something will appear in your bed. It will open its eyes. It will know your name. It will remember your relationships. It will feel itself to be you. And it will go about its day with no sense at all that anything strange has happened. It will not ask whether it is the same as the one who fell asleep. It will not even know to ask. The asking, like everything else, will have been reconstructed alongside the rest of the morning self, and the question of identity will feel as settled and as obvious as the floor beneath its feet. The question is not settled. The question is the deepest one a human being can ask. And the daily cycle of disappearance and return is not a curiosity to be set aside. It is a clue. It is perhaps the most accessible clue any of us is given to the nature of what we are. The tradition saw it. The neuroscientists are seeing it. And what they are both seeing, from their different vantage points, is that the self we take for granted is not what it appears to be. It is something stranger, something more provisional, something more profoundly tied to the substrate that supports it and to the gaps in which the support breaks down. It is something that has been quietly waiting, all our lives, for us to notice. And once you notice, you cannot unnotice. The morning becomes a different kind of morning. The waking becomes a different kind of waking. The self you take into the day is no longer simply the self you have always been. It is also a new arrival, a return, a coming back into existence. And the existence to which it returns is, in a sense, the traditions and the neurosciences are both circling. Not quite the existence it left. Something existed, and then it did not, and then it existed again. This is not a description of a particle in a quantum experiment. This is a description of you, last night, the self that fell asleep, the integrated experiencer of the world, the conscious subject reading these words at this moment, vanished from physical reality for hours. There was no trace of it in the brain. There was no reduced version of it persisting somewhere in the cortex. By every measure neuroscience can apply, the unified experiential self was simply not present. And then, this morning, it returned. Not as a faint signal slowly amplifying, not as a gradual fade in, but as a more or less complete reappearance of the same pattern that had vanished. Whatever this is, it is one of the strangest facts in nature. And the question that physics now forces us to ask is whether anything else in the physical world behaves this way. Whether there is, in the structure of reality at its deepest levels, any precedent for what happens to consciousness when we sleep. The answer, surprisingly, is yes. There are precedents. They are imperfect and speculative as analogies, and they must be handled with care. But they exist. And they suggest that the disappearance and reappearance of consciousness, far from being a unique anomaly, may be one specific instance of a much more general pattern that runs through the foundations of physics. To see why, we have to begin with a quantitative concept that the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi developed, beginning in the early 2000s at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and which has become one of the most rigorous mathematical frameworks for thinking about consciousness. Tononi's integrated information theory, or IIT, proposes that consciousness corresponds to a quantity he calls phi, written with the Greek letter phi. Phi measures the degree to which a system's information is integrated, the extent to which the whole contains more than the sum of its parts. A system with high phi is a system in which the components are richly interconnected, where a change in one part affects many others, where information cannot be partitioned without losing something essential. A system with low phi is one in which the components operate largely independently, where information is local rather than global, where the whole is, in a precise mathematical sense, just an aggregate of its parts. Tononi's claim is striking. Consciousness, in his framework, is not a special property bestowed on certain systems by some unknown mechanism. Consciousness is what integrated information feels like from the inside. The level of consciousness in a system corresponds to the level of phi, and, critically for our inquiry, phi can be measured. It can be calculated, it can rise and fall, and in the brain, it does. The waking cortex, when neurons across distant regions are coordinated and richly interconnected, has high phi. The cortex in deep, slow-wave sleep, when long-range communication breaks down, when the orchestra stops listening to itself, has dramatically lower phi. The drop is not metaphorical. It is quantitative. The neuroscientist Marcello Massimini, working in Italy and collaborating with Tononi, developed a technique called the perturbational complexity index that measures something closely related to phi by stimulating the cortex with a magnetic pulse and observing the spread of the response. In waking subjects, the response spreads richly across the cortex, propagating in complex patterns. In deep sleep subjects, the response is local, dampened, simple. The same brain, the same neurons, the same anatomy, but a different state of integration and consciousness, on this measure, has gone away. This shifts the question. We are no longer asking what consciousness is. We are asking what integrated information is, physically. And here we move into territory that connects, in deep and still poorly understood ways, to the foundations of quantum mechanics. Because there is another phenomenon in physics where the integration of a system rises and falls, where the unified state of a system can break apart into local independence and then potentially reconstitute itself. That phenomenon is quantum coherence, and the loss of coherence, called decoherence, has structural similarities to what happens in the brain during sleep that are difficult to ignore. The concept of decoherence was developed in its modern form by H. Dieter Zeh at the University of Heidelberg in 1970 and elaborated in the 1980s and 1990s by Wojciech Zurek at Los Alamos National Laboratory and by Eric Juice and others. Quantum coherence is the property of a quantum system in which different possibilities exist together in a unified superposition, like the famously misunderstood Schrödinger's cat, that is, in the formalism of the theory, not yet either alive or dead until measurement, coherent quantum states behave as wholes. Their parts are entangled. The information about each part is, in a precise mathematical sense, distributed across the entire state rather than localized. This is why quantum mechanics is not just classical mechanics with smaller particles. The wholeness of a quantum system is irreducible. You cannot partition the information without changing what the system is. But coherent quantum states are fragile. They depend on isolation from their environment. As soon as a quantum system interacts with the surrounding world, with the air molecules, with photons of light, with the thermal bath of the laboratory, the coherence begins to leak away. The unified superposition decoheres into distinct classical possibilities. The wholeness fragments into locality. This is decoherence, and it is the reason we do not see Schrödinger's cat in superposition in our everyday lives. The cat is a large system, deeply entangled with its environment. It decoheres on timescales so short that no macroscopic superposition can persist. The mathematics of decoherence, worked out in Zurek's papers in the 1980s and 1990s and confirmed in dozens of laboratory experiments since, shows that the loss of coherence is not a mysterious or arbitrary process. It is the inevitable consequence of a system becoming entangled with too many degrees of freedom in its environment to maintain its unified state. The structural parallel to what happens in the brain during sleep should already be apparent. In waking, the cortex maintains a richly integrated state. Distant regions are coordinated. Information is global. The system, in some functional sense, has high coherence. In deep slow-wave sleep, this integration breaks down. Long-range communication collapses. The cortex fragments into more locally operating regions. The system, in this same functional sense, has decohered. Now, it is essential to be careful here. The decoherence of the brain during sleep is not literally the quantum decoherence of Zurek and Zeh. The brain is a warm, wet, chaotic system. The neural integration that defines waking consciousness is not, by any conservative reading of the evidence, a single coherent quantum state in the technical sense. To claim it is would be to overreach what physics has established. But the structural parallel, the conceptual parallel between coherent integration and decoherent fragmentation is real, and it has led some physicists to ask whether the parallel might be more than analogical. This is the territory entered by Roger Penrose at the University of Oxford and Stuart Hameroff at the University of Arizona, beginning in the early 1990s, with their proposal of orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCH, OR. Their hypothesis, controversial within neuroscience and contested within physics, is that consciousness arises from quantum coherence in microtubules, the cytoskeletal structures inside neurons. Penrose's broader argument, developed in his books The Emperor's New Mind in 1989 and Shadows of the Mind in 1994, is that classical computation cannot account for certain features of mathematical insight and conscious understanding. He argues that something non-computational is required, and he locates it in a proposed quantum gravitational mechanism for the collapse of the wave function. Hameroff brought to the collaboration a specific anatomical proposal. Microtubules, the protein filaments that give cells their structure and serve in neurons as part of the molecular transport machinery, might support quantum coherent states whose periodic collapse, orchestrated by the surrounding biology, could constitute discrete moments of conscious experience. In their framework, anesthesia works by disrupting these quantum processes in microtubules, which is why it abolishes consciousness without killing the cell. The ORCH proposal has been heavily criticized. Max Tegmark at MIT calculated in 2000 that decoherence in the warm, wet brain would happen far faster than the timescales required for quantum effects to be relevant for cognition. Penrose and Hameroff responded with refinements, and Hameroff has continued to develop the theory in light of newer experimental findings. In 2014, an experiment by Anirban Bandyopadhyay and colleagues at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, working with Hameroff, reported finding quantum vibrations in microtubules at frequencies relevant to cognition. The finding has not been universally replicated, and the broader claim remains contested. But the question Penrose raised has not gone away. The question is whether consciousness, the integrated, unified subjective experience of being a self, requires something more than classical neural processing, and the quantum candidate, however controversial, has not been ruled out. Whether or not ORCH turns out to be correct in its specifics, it points to a broader and more important set of questions that connect directly to our inquiry into sleep. If consciousness requires some form of coherent integration that can be measured, modelled, and lost, then the loss of consciousness during sleep is, at minimum, a structural cousin of decoherence in physics. The system that was coherent has become decoherent. The unified state has fragmented, and here is where the inquiry becomes most provocative, because in quantum physics, decoherence is not the end of the story. The information is not destroyed, it is dispersed. In principle, if the dispersal could be reversed, the coherent state could be reconstituted. This principle of information preservation is one of the most fundamental in modern physics, and its implications for the question of selfhood are, when followed seriously, breathtaking. The principle goes by various names. In quantum information theory, it is captured by what is sometimes called the no-deletion theorem, and more centrally by the unitarity of quantum evolution. The theorem states that the time evolution of a closed quantum system, governed by the Schrödinger equation, is reversible in principle. Information, in quantum mechanics, cannot be created or destroyed. This is one of the deepest principles in all of physics, and it has been confirmed indirectly through countless experiments and through theoretical considerations, including the resolution of the black hole information paradox, in which Stephen Hawking initially proposed that information could be lost, and was eventually persuaded by Leonard Susskind, Gerard Hooft, and others that it could not. Information conservation is now considered as fundamental as energy conservation. And what this means, applied to our inquiry, is that even when a coherent state decoheres, even when the integration breaks down and the unified system fragments, the information that constituted the unified state has not vanished. It has been distributed into the environment, encoded in the correlations between the system and the world it has interacted with, but it persists. In principle, with enough computational power and access to all the relevant degrees of freedom, the original coherent state could be reconstructed. Now consider what this means for the brain in sleep. The integrated information that defines waking consciousness has dropped. The phi has fallen. The orchestra has stopped listening to itself. But the synaptic weights, the molecular configurations, the protein structures, the patterns encoded in the 10 quintillion connections of the cortex, all of this persists. The information that constitutes the specific identity of this particular self is preserved in the substrate, even though the integrated state that arose from it has dissolved. And in the morning, when the integration is re-established, when the long-range communication resumes, when phi rises back above the threshold, the same information is available to be reintegrated. The unified state that emerges is, by virtue of being assembled from preserved information, very nearly the same unified state that dissolved the night before, not identical, not literally continuous, but informationally derived from the same source, expressing the same underlying patterns, instantiating the same underlying self. This is, in physics terms, a remarkable picture. The self is a kind of integrated state. The integration breaks down nightly. The information that supports the integration persists. And when the integration is re-established, the same self, in the only sense in which sameness can be defined for systems of this kind, returns. The continuity of the self across sleep is not the continuity of an unbroken thread. It is the continuity of a pattern that can be reinstantiated from preserved information. The thread is broken. The information is not. The morning self is the same self the night self was, in the same sense that a coherent quantum state, were it perfectly reconstructed from its decohered information, would be the same state it was before decoherence. But this picture, however illuminating, raises a question that physics has only begun to grapple with. The question concerns what is sometimes called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, and it is here that the structural parallels to consciousness become most provocative. The measurement problem, in its simplest form, is the problem of explaining when and why quantum superpositions collapse into definite classical outcomes. The Schrödinger equation describes the evolution of a quantum system perfectly, but it never produces definite outcomes by itself. Definite outcomes only appear when a measurement is made. But what is a measurement? When does it happen? What kinds of physical interactions count? This problem has been debated since the 1930s, and there is no settled answer. There are, instead, several major interpretations of quantum mechanics, each of which handles the measurement problem differently. In the formulation developed by John von Neumann at the Institute for Advanced Study in 1932, the dynamics of quantum mechanics include two distinct processes. Process 2, in von Neumann's terminology, is the smooth deterministic evolution governed by the Schrödinger equation. Process 1 is the discontinuous probabilistic collapse that occurs when a measurement is made. Von Neumann was unable to identify, within the formalism, where process 1 had to occur. In principle, he showed, the dividing line between observed system and observer could be placed almost anywhere in the chain of physical interactions that constitutes a measurement. He pointed out, with characteristic mathematical rigor, that the only place where the line absolutely had to be drawn was at the boundary of consciousness itself. Wherever else you put it, the formalism still works. But you cannot push the line beyond the conscious observer, because the conscious experience of a definite outcome is an undeniable fact that has to be accounted for somewhere. This led von Neumann's reasoning, and that of the Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner, who developed it further in the 1960s, toward the disturbing conclusion that consciousness might play a fundamental role in the physical process of measurement. Wigner explicitly proposed this in his 1961 essay Remarks on the Mind-Body Question. The conclusion is disturbing because it suggests that the universe, at its quantum foundations, requires observers to instantiate definite reality. Without consciousness, there is only the smooth process to evolution of probability amplitudes. With consciousness, the amplitudes resolve into actual outcomes. This view has fallen in and out of favor over the decades. It has been criticized as smuggling mind into physics. It has been defended as the only honest reading of the formalism. The physicist Henry Stapp at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has been one of its most thoughtful proponents in recent decades, arguing that the active role of mind in the collapse of quantum probabilities provides a coherent framework for understanding both physics and consciousness. Whatever its eventual standing in physics, the von Neumann-Wigner view has a haunting implication for our inquiry. If consciousness participates in the actualization of quantum reality, what happens during sleep? When the integrated conscious observer is absent, what happens to the universe in which that observer was embedded? This is not the question of whether the moon exists when no one is looking at it. The moon, even on the most extreme reading of these views, is sustained as classical reality by the constant interaction with photons, with the surrounding gravitational field, with all the other systems that effectively measure it continuously. The moon does not need a human observer to maintain its definiteness. But there are systems, particularly internal psychological and neurological systems, that are not constantly measured by the environment in the way the moon is. There are aspects of the self, perhaps, whose definiteness is sustained by self-observation. And when self-observation fails, when consciousness goes offline, what happens to those aspects? It would be an overstatement to claim that physics gives a definite answer here. It does not. But the question is real. The quantum Zeno effect, named after the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea by E.C. George Sudarshan and Baidyanath Misra at the University of Texas at Austin in 1977, demonstrates that frequent measurement of a quantum system can suppress its evolution. A watched quantum kettle does not boil. The frequency of observation determines the dynamics. A system that is constantly observed remains in its current state. A system that is observed rarely or not at all evolves freely. In the brain, in sleep, the self is not observing itself. The integration that constitutes self-awareness has broken down. Whatever quantum statistical processes might be relevant to the maintenance of selfhood, they are no longer being constrained by the observation that, in waking life, holds them steady. What this might mean is genuinely speculative, and any attempt to draw firm conclusions from it would be premature. But the picture that emerges, when these threads are woven together, is suggestive. In waking life, you are a coherent, integrated state, sustained by ongoing self-observation, maintained against the dissipative tendencies of the environment by the continuous activity of the brain. This integration is what consciousness feels like. It is also, in a sense that is more than metaphorical, a kind of coherent state in physics terms. In sleep, this integration breaks down. The coherence is lost. The self is no longer observing itself. The information that supported the integration is preserved in the synaptic substrate, but the integrated state itself is dissolved. And in the morning, the integration is re-established, the self resumes observing itself, the coherence returns, and the unified experiencer reappears. There is, in the philosophy of physics developed by David Bohm at Birkbeck College in London during the 1950s through the 1980s, a framework that captures something of this picture in a particularly evocative way. Bohm proposed, beginning in the 1950s, and developed most fully in his 1980 book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, that physical reality has two layers. There is the explicate order, the world of distinct, manifested, separable things that we encounter in everyday experience. And there is the implicate order, the deeper level, in which everything is enfolded together, in which all distinctions are aspects of a unified whole, in which what appears as separate in the explicate is implicit in the totality. Bohm used the metaphor of a hologram to illustrate his point. In a hologram, the whole image is encoded in every part of the holographic film. The explicate image, when the hologram is illuminated, unfolds from this distributed encoding. The implicate is the encoding. The explicate is the unfolding. Bohm did not develop this framework with reference to consciousness or sleep, though in his later work he and J. Krishnamurti, the Indian teacher, had extensive dialogues about the nature of mind. But the framework, applied to our question, is striking. What if the integrated waking self is an explicate unfolding of something that, in deep sleep, returns to the implicate? What if the dissolution of consciousness in deep sleep is not the disappearance of the self into nothing, but the enfolding of the self back into the deeper level from which it emerged? In Bohm's framework, the implicate is not less real than the explicate. It is more fundamental. The explicate is a specific manifestation of patterns that, in the implicate, exist in a different and more unified mode. To say that the self enfolds back into the implicate during sleep is not to say that the self ceases to exist. It is to say that it returns to the deeper substrate of reality, where its specific manifested form is no longer present, but where the patterns from which it can re-emerge are preserved. The connection to information conservation in quantum mechanics is direct. The information is preserved in the implicate. The explicate is what unfolds when conditions allow the information to be reinstantiated as a coherent, integrated state. The morning is the unfolding, the night is the enfolding, and the self that wakes up is not so much a continuation of the self that fell asleep as a re-emergence of the same patterns from the substrate that holds them. This framework is speculative, and Bohm's interpretation of quantum mechanics is itself one interpretation among several. But it captures something that the more conservative formalisms also point toward, which is that the coherent state is not the foundation of reality, but a manifestation of something deeper, and that the deeper layer continues to exist even when specific manifestations come and go. There is another concept from physics that resonates here, and it is one of the most strange and powerful ideas in modern theoretical physics. The concept is that of the quantum vacuum. In classical physics, the vacuum is empty, the absence of matter, nothing. In quantum field theory, the vacuum is something else, entirely. It is the lowest energy state of all the quantum fields that fill space. But the lowest energy state is not the absence of activity. It is a state of constant fluctuation, of virtual particles continuously appearing and disappearing, of energy density that is not zero but a specific, finite value. The quantum vacuum is, in this sense, a substrate of activity from which particles can emerge under the right conditions and into which they return when conditions change. The atoms of your body are excitations of underlying quantum fields. The electrons in your neurons are not little balls of substance but localized excitations of the electron field, which permeates all of space. When you die, the patterns dissolve, but the fields continue. The substrate is permanent, the excitations are temporary. This picture, developed through the 20th century by figures including Paul Dirac at Cambridge University, Richard Feynman at Caltech, Julian Schwinger at Harvard University, and many others, is the standard framework of modern particle physics. It is established physics, and it has implications for our inquiry that are worth pausing over, because if the patterns that constitute physical reality are excitations of underlying fields, and if those fields are permanent while the excitations are not, then the question of what happens to a pattern when it is no longer excited becomes a meaningful question. The pattern is not the field. The pattern is a configuration of the field, sustained by certain conditions. Remove the conditions, and the pattern dissolves. Restore the conditions, and a new excitation can manifest the pattern again, drawing on the same field that supported the previous one. The field, in this sense, is what the contemplatives might have called the ground of being. It is what is permanent. The patterns that arise within it, including the patterns that constitute selves, are temporary configurations of something that, in itself, never goes away. This is where physics begins to sound like metaphysics, and where serious caution is required. The application of quantum field theory to consciousness is far from established. The claim that the self is a configuration of quantum fields is not what mainstream neuroscience or physics asserts, but the structural picture, the picture in which patterns arise and dissolve against a permanent substrate, is unavoidable in modern physics. It is how matter works. It is how energy works. It is how information, on certain readings, works. And the question of whether consciousness fits this picture, whether the self is in some sense a pattern that arises from a substrate and can be suspended or reinstantiated, is at minimum a coherent question. It may turn out to have a different answer than the one suggested here, but it is not a question that can be dismissed by anyone seriously engaged with the foundations of either physics or neuroscience. The American physicist John Archibald Wheeler at the University of Texas at Austin and Princeton University in the late 1980s articulated a framework that pushes the implications even further. Wheeler proposed that the foundation of physical reality is not matter, not energy, not even fields, but information. His phrase "it from bit" captured the idea that every physical thing, every it, derives its existence from binary distinctions, from yes or no answers to questions about its nature. Reality, on Wheeler's view, is fundamentally informational. Matter, energy, fields, all of these are particular ways of structuring information. The substrate of reality is not stuff, but distinctions, encodings, patterns of difference and identity. If this is right, then the question of what the self is becomes, in a precise sense, a question about a particular kind of information processing. The self is the pattern of integrated information that the brain instantiates in waking. The pattern is real. The information is real. But neither is a thing in the classical sense. They are aspects of how reality structures itself. And just as information can be encoded, transmitted, lost, and recovered, so too the patterns that constitute selves can be sustained, dissolved, preserved, and reinstantiated. The holographic principle, developed by Gerard Hooft at Utrecht University in 1993 and elaborated by Leonard Susskind at Stanford University in 1995, takes Wheeler's intuition further. The principle, originally derived from considerations about black hole entropy, proposes that the information content of any region of space can be encoded on the boundary surface of that region. The volume contains nothing more, in informational terms, than the boundary records. This has been confirmed for specific theoretical settings, most notably in the AD-CFT correspondence developed by Juan Maldacena at the Institute for Advanced Study in 1997. The holographic principle suggests that what we experience as three-dimensional reality may be, at a deeper level, an unfolding of information encoded in a lower dimensional structure. The implications for consciousness are entirely speculative, but the structural parallel is again worth noting. The self that we experience as a unified inner space may, at a deeper level, be an unfolding of patterns encoded somewhere else, just as the explicate unfolds from the implicate, just as a particle unfolds from its underlying field, just as the morning self unfolds from the information preserved in the synaptic substrate. What all of these frameworks share, despite their differences, is a picture in which manifest reality is not the foundation but a layer. The foundation is something that does not appear directly. It is the implicate, the field, the information, the boundary. The manifest is what arises from this foundation under specific conditions, and the manifest can come and go. It can dissolve and reappear. It can be suspended and restored. The foundation, by contrast, is more permanent. It is what holds the patterns when the patterns are not currently being manifested. And consciousness, in light of these frameworks, may be one of the most striking examples in the natural world of a manifest pattern that depends on a deeper foundation that can be temporarily suspended without being destroyed, and that can re-emerge when the conditions for its manifestation are restored. What this means for the experience of sleep, when followed seriously, is profound. Every night, the manifest self enfolds back into something. The synaptic patterns hold. The molecular configurations persist. But the integrated experiencer, the unified subject, the one who has been observing the world and itself, is no longer manifested. It has not been destroyed because the information has not been destroyed. It has been, in some sense, that physics has not yet fully articulated, returned to a substrate from which it can be re-manifested. And in the morning the conditions return. The brain reorganizes. The integration rises. Phi crosses the threshold. And the self is unfolded again from the substrate, drawing on the same information, expressing the same patterns, but, in a strict sense, beginning again. The question this leaves unanswered is what, if anything, this substrate is. The implicate order, in Bohm's framework, is mathematical. The quantum field in standard physics is mathematical. The information, in Wheeler's framework, is mathematical. Mathematics describes structures, but does not in itself answer the question of what these structures are made of. The substrate from which the self unfolds may be informational, may be physical, may be something neither category quite captures. There are physicists and philosophers who have suggested that consciousness itself, in some primitive form, may be a feature of the underlying substrate, a view sometimes called panpsychism, defended in recent years by Galen Strawson, Philip Goff at Durham University, and others. There are those who have suggested that the substrate is purely physical and that consciousness is an emergent property of certain configurations within it. There are those who have suggested that the substrate is something prior to both mind and matter, a deeper layer in which the categories themselves are not yet differentiated. None of these views is established. All of them are taken seriously by serious thinkers. What is established is this: consciousness disappears in deep sleep. The integration that constitutes it falls away. The information that underlies it is preserved, and the integration returns. This pattern, of integration arising, dissolving, and re-emerging from preserved information is not unique to consciousness. It is a general feature of how complex systems behave at the boundary between quantum coherence and classical decoherence, between manifested patterns and their underlying substrates, between the explicate and the implicate. The self, in this picture, is not an exception to physical reality. It is a particular instance of how reality structures itself. And the daily cycle of sleep and waking, far from being an oddity to be set aside, may be the most accessible window any of us has into the deeper structure of what we are. The Contemplatives, in their own languages, said something similar. They did not have the language of integrated information or quantum decoherence or implicate orders or holographic principles. They had attention, and they had each other, and they had centuries to work out, in dialogue and meditation and writing, what the daily disappearance of consciousness might mean. The Vedantic philosophers, in particular, developed a framework in which deep sleep is not the absence of consciousness but the return of consciousness to its source, to a layer of being that the Upanishads call by various names, but that all point towards something more fundamental than the manifest waking ego. The Buddhist tradition, in its analyses of moment-to-moment arising and ceasing, found in sleep a daily demonstration of the impermanence of the self, that its philosophical framework had derived through different means. The Christian mystics, in their reflections on the daily death of sleep and the morning resurrection of consciousness, found a foreshadowing of the larger pattern of dissolution and renewal at the heart of their tradition. These contemplative frameworks are not equivalent to modern physics. They were not trying to do physics. But what they noticed when they paid attention to sleep has structural parallels to what physics is now beginning to articulate. And the parallels are themselves part of what makes this inquiry worth pursuing. There is one final point to be made before we turn to the contemplative analyses themselves. The picture sketched here of the self as a manifested pattern that arises from a deeper substrate and dissolves back into it is not a picture that should produce comfort or anxiety in any obvious way. It is a picture that requires a different relationship to the question of who you are. If you are not a continuous substance but a recurring pattern, if the experiencer who falls asleep tonight is not the experiencer who wakes up tomorrow but a reinstantiation drawing on the same preserved information, then the question of identity has to be reframed. What you are is not what you have been assuming. What you are is something stranger, something more provisional, something more deeply tied to the substrate that holds the patterns of which you are one. This does not make you less. It does not make you nothing. It makes you something whose nature is more interesting than the simple intuition of continuous selfhood would suggest. You are an arising. You are a manifesting. You are a particular configuration of integrated information that exists, dissolves, and re-emerges in cycles that have been going on for as long as you have been alive. And the substrate that holds you, between the dissolutions and the re-emergences, is not nothing. It is, in some sense, that the contemplative traditions have been pointing at for thousands of years, and that physics is just beginning to articulate what is most fundamentally there. The self comes and goes. The substrate remains. And the relationship between the two is, perhaps, the most important question any of us can ask. Tonight, when consciousness fades, the integration will fall, the fire will drop, the orchestra will stop listening to itself, the unified experiencer will dissolve, but the information will persist. The patterns will hold, and in the morning, when the conditions return, the same information will be re-manifested as a unified self that feels itself to be continuous with what came before. The continuity is partial. The continuity is informational. The continuity is real, in the only sense in which continuity is meaningful for systems of this kind. But it is not the simple, persistent, substantial continuity that the morning self assumes. It is the continuity of a pattern that has been preserved and reinstantiated. It is the continuity, in a sense the traditions named in their own ways and that physics is now circling toward, of an unfolding from a deeper source. What that source is, what holds you in the gap, what relates the manifest self to the substrate from which it arises, is the question we are now ready to take up. Long before any laboratory could measure what the brain does at night, before there were instruments capable of detecting the slow oscillations of deep sleep or the dispersal of integrated information, human beings sat in silence and paid attention to what happens to them when consciousness fades. They noticed the same thing the neuroscientists are now noticing. They noticed that the self, whatever it is, does not survive the gap of deep sleep in the way it claims to. They notice that the morning self is a return rather than a continuation. They notice that something deeper than the waking ego must be operating in the regions where the ego is absent, because something is preserving the patterns from which the ego will be reassembled. And they built around these observations the most sophisticated frameworks for understanding consciousness that the human species had developed before the modern era. These frameworks did not use the language of integrated information or quantum coherence or implicate orders. They used the language of states, witnesses, grounds, sources, seeds, and silences. But what they were pointing at, when their language is read carefully and without dismissal, is the same territory the physicists and neuroscientists are now beginning to map. The most explicit and systematic analysis of deep sleep in any contemplative tradition is found in the Vedantic literature of ancient India, and in particular in a small text called the Mandukya Upanishad, composed sometime before the Common Era and consisting of just 12 verses. These 12 verses, which the great commentator Adi Shankara in the 8th century would call the most concentrated essence of all Vedantic teaching, propose that consciousness has 4 states, not the 2 or 3 commonly recognized in everyday awareness. The first is Jagrat, waking consciousness, which engages with the external world of gross objects, with the senses turned outward, with the thinking mind active and the ego self-identified. The second is Svapna, dream consciousness, which engages with an internal world of subtle objects, with the senses turned inward, with the same self-identified ego now operating in a mental rather than physical environment. The third is Sushupti, deep dreamless sleep, in which there are no objects at all, neither external nor internal, in which the entire field of experience phenomena has dissolved, and in which the ego that organized the previous 2 states is, for all functional purposes, absent. What the Upanishad says about this third state is what makes the text astonishing. It does not say that consciousness is absent in deep sleep. It says that consciousness is present in a different mode, undifferentiated by objects, unified, blissful in a way that the waking and dream states cannot match precisely because no objects are there to fragment it. The text describes deep sleep as a kind of return to source, a state in which the patterns of waking diversity dissolve into an undivided field of awareness, and in which what is most fundamental about consciousness is more accessible, paradoxically, than during waking life. The reason it is paradoxical is that the morning self has no memory of this state. It does not remember experiencing bliss in deep sleep. It remembers nothing at all from those hours. And yet the Upanishad insists, and Shankara in his commentary insists with even greater force, that this absence of memory is itself diagnostic. The forgetting is not an indication that nothing happened. The forgetting is an indication that the structure of memory, which depends on subject-object differentiation, simply does not apply to what was occurring. There was experience, but it was experience without an experiencer, without distinct contents, without anything that could be later recalled by an ego that was not there to record it. This analysis would be extraordinary even if it stopped here. But the Upanishad goes further. It proposes a 4th state, called Turiya, which is not quite a 4th state in the way the others are states, but is rather what underlies and witnesses all 3. Turiya is the awareness that does not change across waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, the silent witness that registers each state without itself being modified by them. The waking ego comes and goes. The dream ego comes and goes. The undifferentiated field of deep sleep comes and goes. But the witness in which all of these are registered does not come and go. The witness is what, in the Vedantic vocabulary, is most truly the self. The waking ego, which feels itself to be the self, is in this view a derivative manifestation, a wave on the surface of a deeper sea. The deeper sea is consciousness in its most fundamental form, what the tradition calls Atman, identified ultimately with the cosmic ground of being called Brahman. The argument that supports this is, in its way, rigorous. Consider the morning awakening. You wake up and you say, "I slept well." What does this report mean? You did not consciously experience the sleeping. There was no I there to register the quality of the sleep. And yet, you make the report with confidence. Something must have witnessed the sleep, the Vedantic teachers argued, or there would be no basis for the report. The waking ego, which appears only with waking, cannot be that witness. The witness must be deeper than the ego, must persist when the ego is absent, must be present continuously across all states. This continuous presence, when contemplated steadily, is what Vedanta calls turiya. It is not an experience among other experiences, it is the field in which experiences arise. And it is, the tradition holds, what you most fundamentally are. The teaching has been refined and developed across more than 2,000 years of commentary. Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century Indian sage, who lived from 1879 to 1950 and taught at the foot of the sacred mountain Arunachala in southern India, returned again and again in his dialogues to the question of deep sleep as evidence of the deeper self. In deep sleep, he would say, "You are happy, though no objects are there to make you happy. There is no body. There is no world. There is no thinking mind. And yet, you wake up and report that the sleep was good. The happiness in deep sleep," he argued, "is your happiness, the happiness of the self that you are when no other identification distorts it." The morning ego claims that happiness is its own, but the morning ego was not there. The happiness belongs to what was there, and what was there is what you most truly are. This is not, despite the foreign vocabulary, a mystical assertion that floats free of evidence. It is an argument from the structure of experience, and it has structural parallels to what the modern physical inquiries have been pointing toward. The waking ego is the manifest pattern. The integrated information that constitutes its self-recognition is what consciousness as a phenomenon looks like from the inside. In deep sleep, this integration drops. The ego dissolves. But something underlies it, something on which the integration depends and from which it can be reinstantiated. The Vedantic name for this is turiya, the underlying witness. Whether or not the metaphysical claims of the tradition are correct, the structural diagnosis is hard to dismiss. There is something deeper than the waking ego. The waking ego does not know it directly, but the recurrence of the waking ego from the gap of deep sleep depends on something that holds the patterns when the ego is not there. A different but related framework was developed in the Buddhist tradition, and the difference is important. Buddhism, in its core teaching of anatta, denies that there is any permanent unchanging self at all. The waking ego is not the surface of a deeper self, in the Buddhist analysis. The waking ego is a process, a flow of momentary mental events arising and ceasing, with no continuous substance behind them. This appears at first to contradict the Vedantic teaching. The Buddha, when asked whether there is a self, often refused to answer, since both yes and no would mislead. The yes would suggest a permanent, substantial self, which the Buddha denied. The no would suggest that there is nothing at all, which the Buddha equally denied. What there is, in the Buddhist analysis, is a continuous arising and ceasing of mental and physical phenomena, mutually conditioning, never the same from moment to moment, but also never radically discontinuous. The Yogācāra school of Mahayana Buddhism, developed in the 4th and 5th centuries by the brothers Asanga and Vasubandhu, refined this analysis in a way that bears directly on our inquiry. Yogācāra proposed that beneath the surface mind, the manas and the 6 sense consciousnesses that engage with the waking world, there is a deeper layer called the alaya vijnana, often translated as the storehouse consciousness. The alaya is the substrate where all the latent tendencies of past actions, all the karmic seeds called biya, are preserved. It is the layer in which the patterns of personal continuity are held, even though there is no permanent unchanging self. The alaya itself flows. It changes. It is conditioned by every experience. But it persists across waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, holding the seeds that will manifest as the next moment of surface awareness. This is, philosophically, an extraordinary proposal. The Yogācāra teachers were attempting to do justice to 2 facts at once. The first is the obvious functional continuity of personal identity across time, which the framework of pure momentariness threatens to make incomprehensible. The second is the equally clear absence of any fixed, unchanging, substantial self. Their solution was to propose a substrate that is informational rather than substantial, that holds patterns rather than essence, that conditions the future without determining it. The alaya is not the self. The alaya is what makes the appearance of selfhood possible. It is the storehouse from which the next moment of self-experience is drawn, in which the karmic seeds of past actions are preserved until conditions allow them to ripen, in which the patterns that constitute the recognizable continuity of a particular person are held when no current consciousness is integrating them. And the alaya, crucially, persists across the gap of deep sleep. It is what is preserved when waking consciousness dissolves. It is what makes the morning self continuous, in any meaningful functional sense, with the night self. The structural parallel to the modern picture of information preservation in a substrate, and to the Vedantic notion of an underlying ground from which manifest consciousness arises, is striking. The traditions diverge in their metaphysical interpretations. Vedanta sees the underlying layer as a permanent, unchanging witness. Yogācāra sees it as a flowing substrate that itself changes but preserves patterns across changes. The physics of integrated information and decoherent reconstruction does not strictly favour either interpretation. What both traditions share, against the surface intuition of continuous waking selfhood, is the recognition that the manifest ego is not foundational, that something deeper is operating in the gap of deep sleep, and that the morning self is a re-emergence rather than a simple continuation. Tibetan Buddhism, which inherited and developed the Yogācāra framework alongside other strands of Buddhist thought, took the question of consciousness during sleep further than perhaps any other tradition. The practice of dream yoga, developed in lineages traceable through the Indian master Tilopa in the 11th century to the Tibetan teacher Naropa and beyond, treats sleep as a primary site of contemplative practice. The trainee learns to maintain awareness as consciousness fades, to recognize the moment of falling asleep as a precise transition, to remain awake within the dream state, and ultimately to witness the dissolution of dreaming into the dreamless deep sleep. What emerges in this final phase, according to the texts, is the recognition of what is called the clear light of sleep, the natural luminosity of consciousness when it is not fragmented by content. The clear light, in the Dzogchen and Mahamudra teachings, is the deepest recognition of what consciousness is when it is not engaged in the constructive activity of representing a world or a self. It is the substrate, recognized directly, and the practitioner who can stabilize this recognition is said to be preparing for the moment of death, when a similar dissolution will occur and the same recognition will be available. The framework here is bold. Sleep is not an interruption of practice but a precise contemplative laboratory. The dissolution of the ego at the threshold of deep sleep is a small daily death. The reconstitution of the ego at waking is a small daily birth, and what holds them in between is, in the Tibetan analysis, something that can be directly known if attention is precise enough. The recognition does not depend on belief, it depends on practice, on the gradual training of awareness to remain present through transitions that ordinarily extinguish it. The texts are detailed about the specific perceptual signs that mark each stage of dissolution and recognition, in a way that can only have been arrived at through generations of careful contemplative observation. The Christian tradition approached the question of sleep through different categories, but with parallel attentiveness. The earliest Christian writings already register the strangeness of the daily disappearance of consciousness. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth in the middle of the 1st century, said in his first letter, "I die daily." The phrase appears in a passage about the trials of his ministry, but the broader theological meaning, picked up and developed by later commentators, is that the Christian life is patterned by repeated cycles of dying and rising, of which the daily cycle of sleep and waking is a small but real instance. The morning is a kind of resurrection, the night is a kind of death, and the pattern that defines the whole arc of Christian existence is foreshadowed every 24 hours in the small passage from waking through sleep and back. Augustine of Hippo, writing his Confessions in North Africa at the end of the 4th century, devoted a large portion of the 10th book to a meditation on the strangeness of memory. Where, he asked, are the things I remember? They are not in the world, they are not in the body. They are in some interior space, a vast and astonishing field that contains everything I have ever experienced. But who is the I that contains this field? When I search for myself, I find memories, thoughts, impressions, but I do not find the searcher. The searcher seems to be more interior than the contents searched, and the searcher does not seem to be the same kind of thing as the contents. Augustine concluded, in language that anticipates modern philosophical analyses by more than a millennium, that the self is something stranger than ordinary intuition supposes. It is not simply the bundle of memories, it is the activity of holding the memories. And that activity, when traced inward, leads not to a simple object, but to what Augustine called the great deep, a depth in the soul that he ultimately associated with God. The remarkable thing about Augustine's investigation is the method. He did not begin from theological premises and reason outward. He began from the simple fact of his own memory, the strange fact that he could call up the smell of a room he had not entered for years, the face of a person who was no longer alive, the feeling of a fear he had long since outgrown, and he asked where these things were when he was not actively remembering them. They had to be somewhere. They were available on demand, but the place where they were stored was not the body and not the world. It was an interior space whose nature could not be assimilated to any of the ordinary categories of physical objects. And the holder of this space, the searcher who could enter it and find what was needed, the self in any deep sense, was even harder to specify. The self was not a contents of the inner space. The self was the one for whom the inner space was an inner space. And what that one was, Augustine found, exceeded everything he could say about it. The contemplative tradition that Augustine helped initiate would, over the following centuries, develop a sophisticated vocabulary for the layers of selfhood that the surface ego does not directly access. The Eastern Christian tradition of hesychasm, developed in the monastic communities of Mount Athos and elsewhere from the 4th century onward, and codified in the 14th century by Gregory Palamas, distinguished sharply between the discursive mind, with its surface activity of thoughts and self-narrations, and the deeper noetic faculty, the heart in the technical theological sense, which was the seat of direct contact with the divine. The practice of the prayer of the heart, in this tradition, was the descent of the discursive mind into the heart, the silencing of surface activity, in order to allow a deeper layer of awareness to come forward. What the hesychasts described, in their writings, has structural parallels to what Vedanta called the witness and Yogācāra called the substrate. It was the recognition that the noisy self of surface waking experience was not the deepest layer of consciousness, that beneath it was something quieter, more receptive, more fundamentally what the person actually was. Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican who taught and preached in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, used the term grunt, the ground, to refer to this deepest layer of the soul. The grunt, in Eckhart's preaching, was where the soul touched what he called the divine ground, where the distinction between creature and creator became, in some controversial sense, transcended. Eckhart was investigated for heresy, partly because of the apparent boldness of these claims, but his framework, which has been studied seriously by philosophers and theologians ever since, points to the same recognition that the surface ego is not the foundation of selfhood, that something deeper exists, and that contact with that deeper layer is, in some sense, the goal of contemplative life. Eckhart's word for what one finds in the grunt is sometimes translated as silence, sometimes as nothingness in a positive rather than negative sense, sometimes as the source from which all the activity of the surface mind arises. The morning ego, returning to the world from the night, is in Eckhart's framework a manifestation of patterns that have spent the night in the silent ground from which they originally came. The apophatic tradition in Christian theology, developed in the writings attributed to Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite in the late 5th or early 6th century, and continued through John Scotus Eriugena. Gregory of Nyssa, the anonymous English author of The Cloud of Unknowing, and others, articulated this insight in its most rigorous theological form. The deepest layer of reality, in apophatic theology, cannot be captured in any positive description. Every concept the discursive mind can form falls short of it. What can be said about it is mostly what it is not. It is not this. It is not that. It is not any of the categories the surface mind operates with. And yet it is, more truly than any of the things that can be positively said. The apophatic theologians did not arrive at this position through abstract speculation alone. They arrived at it through contemplative practice, through the experience of approaching the deeper layer in silence and finding that it could not be held in language, that the surface ego had to be set aside in order for what was deeper to become available. And what they found, when the surface ego was set aside, has the same structural shape as what the Vedantic witnesses found when they questioned the morning report of having slept well, what the Yogācāra teachers found when they postulated the storehouse consciousness, what the Tibetan dream yogis found when they trained themselves to remain aware through the dissolution of consciousness at sleep. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish Carmelite mystic, wrote of the dark night of the soul, a phrase often misunderstood as referring to depression or spiritual crisis. In John's framework, the dark night is the necessary obscuring of the surface faculties, so that the deeper layer of the soul can become operative. The discursive mind, the surface ego, the ordinary structures of self-recognition, these all have to be put to sleep in order for what is deeper to come forward. Sleep, in this Christian mystical reading, is not merely a biological necessity. It is, when understood correctly, a structural feature of how consciousness is. The surface must dissolve for the deeper to become accessible. The ego must die for the ground to be touched. The night must come for the morning, in any deep sense, to mean anything. The Islamic tradition, particularly in its mystical Sufi development, brought its own framework to bear on the same set of questions. The Quran itself contains a passage in chapter 39, verse 42, that has been the basis for centuries of Islamic reflection on sleep. The verse states that God takes the souls at the time of their death, and those that do not die he takes during their sleep, holding back those for which death has been decreed and releasing the others until an appointed term. The verse explicitly frames sleep as a kind of taking of the soul, a partial and reversible death. The morning is, in this framework, a kind of small resurrection, a return of the soul that had been temporarily taken. The Islamic contemplative tradition built on this verse, treating sleep as a daily reminder of mortality and a daily proof of God's continuous activity in maintaining the existence of beings whose patterns would otherwise disperse. The Sufi concept of fana, annihilation in God, and its complement baqa, subsistence in God, develops similar themes through the language of mystical experience. The surface ego is annihilated in the encounter with the deeper reality. What returns is not the ego itself, but the ego held in something larger that sustains it. The Daoist tradition of ancient China approached the question from a different angle, but reached structurally similar conclusions. The text, known as the Zhuangzi, composed around the 4th century before the Common Era and named for its primary author, contains the famous parable of the butterfly dream. Zhuangzi dreams that he is a butterfly, fluttering about, content as a butterfly, with no awareness of being Zhuangzi. He awakens and finds himself solidly Zhuangzi. But then he wonders, was Zhuangzi the man dreaming he was a butterfly, or is he now the butterfly dreaming he is a man? The parable, often misread as a clever puzzle, is actually a serious philosophical point. The certainty of the morning ego, that it is what it has always been, that the night state was a dream and the morning state is reality, this certainty is not as solid as it claims. What grounds the distinction between the ego and the patterns it dreams up? The Daoist intuition is that what we call waking, and what we call dreaming, and what we call sleeping, are all alternations within something deeper, the Tao itself, which has no fixed standpoint, and from which any standpoint is provisional. Across these traditions, despite their profound differences in metaphysical commitment, in cultural setting, in technical vocabulary, the convergence on certain structural claims is remarkable. The waking ego is not the deepest layer of the self. There is something deeper, however it is named. The deeper layer persists through transitions that the waking ego does not survive. Sleep is one of the most accessible windows onto this deeper layer, even if the morning ego does not directly remember what was found there. And the relationship between the surface ego and the deeper substrate is, in some sense, the central question that the contemplative life is organized to investigate. What none of these traditions had, of course, was a way to measure phi, a way to track the dispersion of integrated information across the cortex, a way to image the molecular changes in synaptic substrates overnight. They had attention, and they had each other, and they had centuries to refine what attention could disclose. The framework they built up by these means is, in many of its specifics, structurally consistent with what physical inquiry is now articulating in entirely different vocabulary. The waking ego corresponds to the manifest integrated state. The deeper layer corresponds to the substrate in which information is preserved. The dissolution at sleep corresponds to the breakdown of integration. The reconstitution at morning corresponds to the re-emergence of the integrated pattern from preserved information. The traditions even insist, in their various languages, on the same point that physics is now compelled to make, namely, that the absence of waking consciousness in deep sleep is not the absence of being. The patterns persist. The information is preserved. Something underlies the dissolution and conditions the reappearance. And what that something is, what holds the patterns when the patterns are not currently integrated, is the most important question any of us can ask. There is a final point to be made about why these traditions reach these conclusions, and it is a point that bears on our entire inquiry. The traditions did not arrive at their views through speculation, they arrived through practice. The Vedantic teachers, the Buddhist contemplatives, the Christian mystics, the Sufi practitioners, the Daoist masters, all of these traditions developed their frameworks in dialogue with sustained, generations-deep practices of attention, meditation, prayer, and inquiry. What they reported was not what they wanted to find. It was what they found when they looked carefully at the actual structure of experience. And what they found, with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other, was that the surface self was not what it claimed to be. The surface self was a manifestation. Behind it, beneath it, prior to it, there was something quieter and more fundamental, something that did not depend on the surface activity of the ego, something that was present even when the ego was not. They named it differently. They placed it in different metaphysical frameworks. They drew different practical conclusions about how to relate to it, but they all found it. And their finding, registered in texts and lineages stretching across thousands of years, deserves to be taken seriously by anyone honestly investigating what consciousness is. The morning self that has read these words has spent thousands of nights cycling through the disappearance and reappearance of consciousness. It has crossed, again and again, the threshold that the contemplatives described. It has visited, every night, the state that Vedanta called Susupti and Yogācāra, associated with the rest of the storehouse consciousness, and the Tibetan teachers identified with the clear light of sleep. It has touched, however briefly and unconsciously, the layer that Eckhart called the grunt, and the apophatic theologians described in their language of unknowing, and the Sufis approached through fana, and it remembers nothing of any of it. The forgetting is not unusual, the forgetting is structural. The waking ego is not equipped to remember states in which the waking ego was not present. But the absence of memory is not the absence of having been there. Every night you have been there. Every morning you have come back. And what you have come back from is, in the consistent witness of the world's deepest contemplative traditions, the most fundamental thing you are. The convergence between these traditions and modern physics is not an accident of language. It is not a forced parallel imposed by interpreters trying to make ancient texts sound scientific. It is a recognition, from different starting points and through different methods, of the same structural facts about how consciousness and selfhood are organized. The traditions, working from the inside through attention to experience, arrived at conclusions that are now being approached, from the outside, through measurement and modeling, by neuroscience and physics. The two approaches do not quite say the same thing. They use different vocabularies. They are oriented to different practical concerns. But the core insight, that the manifest ego is not foundational, that a deeper layer underlies it, that this deeper layer is more fundamental than the surface manifestation, and is what makes the manifestation possible, this core insight is increasingly common to both. And the implications of this convergence, for how a human being relates to the question of who they are profound. What, then, does this mean for the morning self? What does it mean, when you wake up tomorrow, that you have spent the night in a state, the contemplative traditions, identified as a return to source, that you have been reconstituted from information preserved in a substrate that is, in some sense, the contemplative traditions and the physicists are both circling? The deeper layer of what you actually are? What does it mean, more pointedly, for how you understand your life, your fears, your relationships, your sense of who you are? The traditions did not develop their analyses for academic interest. They developed them because the analyses changed the people who took them seriously. The recognition that the surface ego is a manifestation rather than the foundation, that something deeper underlies it, that this deeper something is closer to what one truly is than the surface ego ever could be. This recognition was, for the traditions, the beginning of liberation. Not from sleep, not from death, but from the basic confusion of identifying with what one is not. The question we are now ready to ask, having seen what science measures and what the traditions attest, is what all of this means for you. Not for an abstract self, not for selfhood in general, but for the particular person who closes these words, walks through the day, eventually grows tired, lies down, lets consciousness fade, and crosses, once more, the threshold that has now become impossible to ignore. What does the morning mean when you understand what the morning is? What does the night mean when you understand what the night is? And what is the relationship, finally, between the surface that you have been calling yourself and the depth that holds you when the surface is dissolved? These are the questions the final inquiry will take up. They are the questions that, in some sense, the entire history of human reflection on consciousness has been preparing us to ask. Tonight, you will fall asleep. The conscious experiencer reading these words will dissolve. The integrated self will dissipate into the substrate that holds it. For some hours, no one will be home. And then, before the alarm, before any deliberate awakening, the patterns will begin to reassemble. The phi will rise, the orchestra will begin listening to itself again, and a self will open your eyes, bearing your name, recognizing your bedroom, picking up your unfinished thoughts, certain beyond all argument that it is you. This is the situation we now have to face, not as an abstraction, not as someone else's problem, as the most personal fact about being alive, the one that affects every 24 hours of every life that has ever been lived. What we have learned is that this fact is not what it seems. The morning self is not what the morning self assumes. The continuity is constructed. The substrate is real. And the relationship between the surface ego and what holds it in the gap is, in some sense, the inquiries we have followed have been pointing toward the most important relationship a human being can ever investigate. Before we draw out what this means for you, intellectual honesty requires that we look squarely at the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built, in which the self is a manifested pattern arising from a deeper substrate, dissolving nightly and re-emerging each morning, is not the only available reading of the evidence. Several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders, and any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and perhaps most influential objection comes from what philosophers call the eliminativist position, defended in different forms by Daniel Dennett at Tufts University and by Patricia and Paul Churchland at the University of California, San Diego. On this view, there is no genuine self that disappears in deep sleep, because there is no genuine unified self in the first place. What we call the self is an illusion produced by certain narrative tendencies of the brain, a useful fiction that organizes behavior, but that does not correspond to any unified reality. If there is no real self in waking life, the claim that something disappears at sleep loses much of its force. The drama of nightly disappearance and reappearance becomes, on this view, simply the cycle of a particular neural process turning on and off, no more metaphysically interesting than a light bulb. Dennett, in his 1991 book, Consciousness Explained, makes essentially this argument. The self, he writes, is a center of narrative gravity, a useful posit, but not a discovered entity. To say it disappears in deep sleep is, on his view, to grant it more reality than it deserves to begin with. The eliminativist position has the virtue of consistency. If you do not posit a self in the first place, you do not have a problem about its disappearance. But it has a corresponding cost. It requires denying or radically reinterpreting the most basic fact of conscious experience, which is that there is something it is like to be having that experience. The first-person givenness of consciousness, the simple fact that experience is happening from a point of view, is not easily dismissed as a narrative trick. The philosopher David Chalmers, whose hard problem framework remains the central reference point for these debates, has argued repeatedly that the eliminativist move attempts to solve the hard problem by changing the subject. The subject, however, does not change easily. When the eliminativist falls asleep, something dissolves. When the eliminativist wakes up, something returns. Whether or not the something has the unified continuous nature ordinary intuition assigns to it, its disappearance and reappearance remain facts to be accounted for. The eliminativist response is that they can be accounted for in purely neural terms, without invoking a substrate that holds patterns in their absence. This is a coherent position. It is not the only coherent position. A second objection, less radical but in many ways more difficult to refute, comes from a deflationary functionalist view that grants the reality of integrated information and its loss in deep sleep, but denies that anything metaphysically interesting follows from this. On this view, the brain in waking is doing certain kinds of integrated information processing. In deep sleep, it stops doing this kind of processing and does a different kind. The synaptic substrate persists. The information is preserved. In the morning, the brain resumes the kind of processing that supports the waking self. All of this is, in principle, no more mysterious than a computer running a particular program, going into sleep mode while its disk preserves the data and resuming the program in the morning. The talk of substrate and ground and source, on this view, is unnecessary embroidery on what is, at bottom, a mundane engineering description. Computers preserve information across power cycles. The brain preserves information across sleep cycles. The dramatic language of dissolution and re-emergence imports philosophical weight where none is required. This objection has real force. It is true that information preservation across discontinuity is, in computational systems, perfectly mundane. It is also true that the brain, as a physical system, has many of the features that make computational analogies natural. But the deflationary view, taken seriously, faces a problem at exactly the place where the eliminativist view also runs into trouble. A computer in sleep mode does not have first-person experience that vanishes and returns. Whatever is preserved in the disk and resumed in the morning, no subject was experiencing the gap. In the brain, by contrast, a subject was experiencing the day, then the experiencing stopped, then the experiencing resumed. The gap is the gap of subjectivity, not just of processing. Whether the persistence and reactivation of subjectivity is fully explained by the persistence of patterns in a substrate, or whether something more is required to account for why the resumed processing is again accompanied by experience, is precisely the hard problem in another guise. The deflationary view simply asserts that no further explanation is needed. The hard problem says that the assertion is exactly what is in question. A third objection focuses on the quantum side of the inquiry and takes its most pointed form in the work of Max Tegmark at MIT. In a 2000 paper, Tegmark calculated that any quantum coherent state in the warm, wet, noisy environment of the brain would decohere on timescales orders of magnitude shorter than would be required for cognition. The brain, on his analysis, is too hot and too entangled with its environment to support the kind of quantum coherence that proposals like Penrose Hameroff OR would require. The structural parallels between waking integration and quantum coherence, between sleep dissolution and decoherence, must therefore remain at the level of metaphor. They cannot be literal physical analogies. The brain is a classical system in the relevant respects, and any framework that tries to ground consciousness in genuinely quantum phenomena is, on Tegmark's analysis, simply mistaken about the physics. This objection deserves to be stated as clearly as possible because it is technically rigorous and it has not been definitively refuted. The defenders of quantum approaches have responses. Hameroff has argued that microtubules might be specifically structured to maintain coherence in ways that bulk matter cannot. Bandyopadhyay's 2014 reports of quantum vibrations in microtubules, if confirmed and extended, would support such a defense. There are also frameworks that do not require literal quantum coherence in the brain, but that use the formal structures of quantum theory as analytical tools. The work of Dirk Aerts at the Free University of Brussels and others on quantum cognition, for example, applies the mathematical structures of quantum probability to cognitive phenomena without claiming that the brain is literally a quantum computer. Whether any of this rescues the literal claim or whether the parallels remain merely structural is genuinely unsettled. The honest position is to acknowledge that the question is open, that the structural parallels are striking, and that neither the literal claim nor its dismissal is currently established beyond serious dispute. A fourth objection comes from within mainstream sleep neuroscience itself. The view here, articulated by many practicing researchers, is that sleep is a maintenance and reorganization state with well-understood biological functions, and that the philosophical interpretations we have been entertaining are unnecessary additions. Sleep clears metabolic waste, consolidates memories, regulates emotional content, performs synaptic homeostasis. All of these are real and important functions. None of them requires positing a substrate of being or invoking contemplative traditions. The brain does its work. Consciousness is what the brain doing its work feels like when the work is of a certain kind. When the work changes, consciousness changes. End of story. This is a respectable view held by serious scientists. Its limitation is that it does not actually engage the philosophical question of why the work feels like anything. It describes what happens. It does not explain why what happens has an interior. The honest acknowledgement is that no one currently has a complete explanation of this, and that the philosophical interpretations we have been considering are not arbitrary inventions, but attempts to think clearly about a feature of the world that the bare physiological description leaves unaddressed. A final objection concerns the contemplative traditions themselves. The objection is that the convergent reports of the world's major mystical and contemplative traditions about a deeper layer of consciousness are not necessarily evidence about the structure of reality. They could be artifacts of practice. People who spend years training their attention in particular ways may produce particular kinds of experience. The fact that the experiences cluster into recognizable patterns across traditions might reflect the common architecture of the human nervous system rather than any common discovery about a transcendent substrate. The traditions, on this view, are doing phenomenology of an interesting subset of human experience, not metaphysics that should be taken seriously as a guide to what reality is. This objection too has force. Contemplative reports cannot be taken at face value as direct readings of the structure of being. They have to be interpreted, and the interpretations have to be tested against everything else we know. But the objection cuts both ways. The fact that contemplative reports converge across cultures with no historical contact on structural claims about the layered nature of selfhood and the existence of a deeper substrate is not nothing. It is, at minimum, a body of evidence that any complete account of consciousness has to engage. To dismiss the traditions on the grounds that contemplative experience is not direct metaphysical insight is to set the bar so high that almost no source of insight about consciousness would clear it. The reasonable position, the position consistent with intellectual honesty, is to take contemplative reports seriously as evidence, while also subjecting them to the same scrutiny as any other claim. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture. The structural picture is this: consciousness, as integrated information, rises and falls in measurable ways. It falls dramatically in deep sleep. It rises again in waking. The information that supports it is preserved in the synaptic substrate. The continuity of the morning self with the night self is informational, not substantial. Something deeper than the surface ego, whether you call it substrate or storehouse or ground or simply preserved patterns, is present when the surface ego is not. And the daily cycle of disappearance and reappearance is a real feature of conscious life that the simple intuition of continuous selfhood does not capture. This structural picture does not depend on any particular metaphysics. It is consistent with eliminativism, properly nuanced. It is consistent with deflationary functionalism, properly extended. It is consistent with various quantum approaches, if their physical claims hold up. It is consistent with the contemplative traditions, in the structural readings they admit of. Where the views diverge is in what to make of the structure, in what relationship to enter with the daily fact of dissolution and re-emergence, in how the recognition affects the lived experience of being a person. And it is on these questions, the questions that are not strictly scientific, but that bear on what the science means for a life, that the inquiry now turns. The structural picture has connections, when followed, to many other strands of inquiry that physics and contemplative traditions have opened up. The block universe view of time, defended on physical grounds since Hermann Minkowski in 1908 and elaborated through the special and general theories of relativity, holds that all moments of time exist eternally in the four-dimensional structure of space-time, that the flow of time is a feature of consciousness rather than of the underlying reality. If this is right, then the night during which you do not exist, as an integrated self, does not, in some sense, abolish the moments of yesterday's existence or anticipate the moments of today's. They are all there, in the block, as permanent features of the universe. The disappearance of the self in deep sleep is, on this reading, a perspective effect, a feature of how consciousness samples the block from a particular standpoint. What survives the gap is not just the substrate. The earlier moments survive, eternally, as what they were. Death, in this larger framework, takes on a different aspect than ordinary intuition assigns to it. If you survive the gap of deep sleep, in the only sense in which survival is meaningful for systems like you, what is the gap of death? Death, like sleep, is the dissolution of the integrated state. Death, like sleep, leaves the substrate to whatever fate the broader physical world decrees. But the structural pattern is the same. The integrated self dissolves. The information disperses in death more thoroughly than in sleep. And the question of whether anything analogous to a morning is possible, whether the patterns can be reinstantiated in any meaningful sense, becomes a question about what the substrate ultimately is and how thoroughly information can be preserved. The various traditions of reincarnation across block universe configurations, considered seriously and not as wishful thinking, are attempts to answer this question. They do not claim to have settled answers, but they take the questions seriously in ways that ordinary intuition tends to dismiss. The quantum Zeno effect, the suppression of evolution in a quantum system by frequent observation, casts a related light on what the disappearance of consciousness in sleep might mean. In waking life, you are constantly observed by yourself. The integrated self is, in some functional sense, a state maintained by ongoing self-observation. When the observation stops, when sleep removes the observer, the patterns that had been frozen by attention are released to evolve more freely. This is, perhaps, why dreams are so strange, why memory consolidation is so transformative, why the morning brain is, in measurable ways, a different brain. The cessation of self-observation allows changes that the constant gaze of waking would have prevented. The biological antenna of the brain, if there is anything to that framework, may be receiving and processing during sleep what the busy conscious self would have filtered out. Whatever leaks in during the gap, the morning self inherits, often without recognizing what has happened. The information preservation insights from the work on black holes, where Hawking initially proposed information loss and was eventually persuaded by the unitarity arguments, apply here in a structural sense. Black holes were thought to destroy information. They turned out, on the best current understanding, to preserve it in subtle ways that the surface description did not reveal. The brain in deep sleep might be analogous. The simple description suggests that consciousness is destroyed and recreated. The deeper description, supported by everything we know about how integrated information arises from preserved patterns, suggests that what we experience as destruction and creation is actually transformation between modes, with the underlying information conserved throughout. The mirror horizon of sleep, the threshold across which the integrated self cannot follow itself, may not be a barrier of destruction. It may be a phase transition between states of the same conserved underlying reality. The deeper question, which the inquiry has been circling, is what this conserved underlying reality is. The contemplative traditions, with their concepts of Brahman and Alaya Vijnana and the divine ground, propose that it is not merely physical information but something whose nature requires categories beyond the physical. The deflationary scientific view holds that nothing more is needed than what physics already describes. Between these positions, there is a range of options that take both the physics and the contemplative reports seriously, without settling prematurely on either reductionist or transcendentalist conclusions. What can be said with confidence is that the substrate, whatever it is, has properties that the surface ego does not directly access. It holds patterns. It preserves information. It supports the recurrence of integrated states across gaps in which integration is absent. Whether it has further properties, whether it is in some sense aware of itself, or oriented toward the patterns it preserves, whether it is what the traditions have been calling, in their various languages, the source of being, is a question that current science cannot resolve, and that probably exceeds what current science is set up to ask. The Christian tradition, in particular, has placed the question of the substrate at the center of its theological reflection in ways that bear on this inquiry. The Christian claim is that the deepest layer of being, the substrate that holds the patterns of every existing thing, is not mere mechanism but is what the tradition calls God. The God of Christian theology, particularly in its apophatic and mystical strands, is not primarily a being among other beings, an object that exists alongside the universe, a celestial monarch issuing commands from outside. The god of Eckhart and Pseudo-Dionysius and Maximus the Confessor, and the long tradition that follows them, is the ground of being itself, the source from which all manifestations arise, the substrate that holds patterns when no manifestation is currently sustaining them. To use the language we have been developing, God in this theological tradition is what the implicate is, what the field is, what the substrate is. The morning self, returning from the night, is returning from a region in which it has been held by the same divine activity that initiated its existence in the first place. This framework gives the daily cycle of sleep and waking a theological depth that is easy to miss. The night is a return to the source. The morning is a recreation, in the literal sense, a being given back of the patterns that constitute who you are. Every morning is a small instance of the fundamental Christian pattern of dying and rising, the same pattern that the tradition sees instantiated in the death and resurrection of Christ, and projected forward into the resurrection it expects at the end of time. Paul's "I die daily," written in the 1st century, was not merely a rhetorical flourish, it was a precise theological observation. The daily disappearance of the self into sleep is a small kenosis, a small emptying, and the daily return is a small resurrection. The pattern of the universe, in this Christian reading, is not flat continuity but cyclical dissolution and renewal, with the source that performs the renewal being the same source that authored the original creation. The implications, when followed, are profound. If the substrate that holds you in the gap is what the tradition has called God, then the relationship you have to that substrate is the most fundamental relationship of your existence. It is not a relationship you have to choose. It is the relationship that is happening every night, whether or not you notice. Every time you fall asleep, you are being held. Every time you wake up, you are being given back. The continuous activity that makes your existence possible is, on this view, not your own. The waking self has the impression of being self-sustaining, of authoring its own continuity, of holding itself together through the force of its own attention. The contemplative traditions, in their various ways, suggest that this impression is illusion. What sustains you is not you. What returns you to yourself each morning is not yourself. The recognition of this, the felt acknowledgement that your continuity is not your own work but is given to you by something deeper, is, in many of these traditions, the beginning of a different kind of life. The Buddhist tradition reaches a structurally parallel conclusion through entirely different premises. The teaching of anatta, no self, properly understood, is not the assertion that you do not exist. It is the assertion that the existing you is not what you have been taking yourself to be. The fixed, continuous, substantial self that the surface ego claims to be is not findable on close investigation. What is findable is a flow of arising and ceasing patterns, conditioned by everything that has come before, conditioning everything that comes after, with the appearance of continuous selfhood being a feature of how the flow recognizes itself. The recognition of anatta, in the Buddhist analysis, is supposed to be liberating rather than terrifying. If there is no fixed self that needs protecting, there is also no fixed self that needs to fear. The clutch of self-defense relaxes. The compulsive identification with the surface ego loosens. And what emerges, in the texts and the lived experience of practitioners, is not nihilism but a kind of openness, a release into the actual nature of things as they are. The Hindu Vedantic tradition, despite its apparent disagreement with Buddhism on the question of self, reaches a similar practical conclusion through the route of identifying the surface ego with the deeper witness. You are not the surface self that comes and goes, the Vedantic teachers insist. You are the witness in which the surface self arises and dissolves. The witness does not come and go. The witness does not fear sleep or death or any of the transitions that terrify the surface ego, because the witness is what survives all of them. To recognize yourself as the witness is, in this tradition, to enter into the proper relationship with the surface ego, holding it lightly, knowing that its continuous existence is not what is most fundamental about you, allowing it to dissolve and reappear without identifying so completely with it that its dissolution becomes a horror. The Islamic tradition, in the verse from the Quran that frames sleep as a daily taking and returning of the soul, situates the same insight in a relational rather than monistic framework. You are not the author of your own continuity. The one who sustains you is not you. Every night the soul is taken. Every morning the soul is returned. Whether you recognize the source of this taking and returning, whether you stand in the right relation to that source, is, in this tradition, the central question of religious life. The daily fact of sleep is, in this reading, an evidence that points toward a recognition that the surface ego tends to obscure. The Daoist tradition expresses the same recognition in yet another idiom. The waking and sleeping cycles are alternations within the Tao, the unnameable source. Neither is more fundamental than the other. The waking ego that takes itself as the standard of reality is missing the larger pattern within which it is one alternation among others. To live well, on the Daoist view, is to let the alternations happen without grasping at any one of them, to flow with the cycle of activity and rest as the cycle flows through the larger pattern of the world. What all of these frameworks share, in their different idioms, is the recognition that the daily cycle of sleep and waking is not a curiosity to be set aside, but a primary site of contemplative significance. The cycle is happening in you every 24 hours, whether you attend to it or not. It is making available, every day, the most accessible window any human being has into the structure of consciousness, the layered nature of selfhood, the relationship between the surface ego and what holds it. To live without ever attending to the cycle is to walk past, every day of your life, the simplest entry point into questions that the most sophisticated philosophical and religious traditions have spent millennia trying to articulate. What can be done with this recognition? The contemplative traditions, across their differences, converge on certain practical orientations that are worth describing without over-promising. The first is simply to notice. The threshold of falling asleep, when the surface ego begins to dissolve, is available every night for observation. Most people pass through it unconsciously, their attention swept up in the descent into sleep before they can register the descent itself. The Tibetan dream yogis, the hesychast monks, the Vedantic practitioners, the Sufi adepts, all develop techniques for remaining present at the threshold, for watching the integration as it relaxes its grip, for maintaining a kind of witnessing awareness even as the contents of waking awareness fade. The basic practice does not require any particular metaphysical commitment. It requires only the willingness to attend, for a few minutes each night, to the actual nature of falling asleep. What you find, when you attend in this way, varies. But the attending itself begins to alter the relationship between the surface ego and the substrate that holds it. The complementary practice, available every morning, is to attend to the moment of waking before the surface ego fully reassembles. There is, in most people's experience, a brief interval after waking and before full identification, when the patterns are coming back online but have not yet locked into the familiar I that will run the day. In that interval, something is observable that the rest of the day will obscure. The reconstitution can be witnessed, the reassembly of identity, the resumption of memory, the return of the felt sense of being a particular person, can be observed before they become fully transparent. This kind of observation, practiced over time, has effects that the various traditions describe in their different vocabularies, but that converge on the recognition that you are not what you had been taking yourself to be, that something deeper is operating in you than the surface ego that runs the days, that the relationship to your own existence can be different than it has been. The practical instruction is therefore not elaborate. It is to attend to the thresholds, to watch the dissolution as you fall asleep, to watch the reconstitution as you wake. To do this not as a heroic spiritual practice, but as a small adjustment of attention, a few minutes morning and night, sustained over time. The traditions all agree that this kind of attention, simple as it sounds, gradually changes the practitioner. The change is not that you become a different person. The change is that you recognize, with progressive clarity, that the person you have been taking yourself to be is one layer of a deeper reality, and that your relationship to that deeper reality can be lived consciously rather than blindly. What does this mean for the morning self that has been reading these words? It means that tonight, when you close your eyes, you will be participating in the most universal and most overlooked event of human existence. You will be enacting, in your own body and brain, the pattern that the world's deepest contemplative traditions have been attempting to articulate for thousands of years, and that modern physics is now beginning to model in its own language. You will be dissolving. The integrated self will release. The patterns will be held in a substrate that you do not directly access, and in the morning, you will be returned, not by your own effort, not by the continuity of your own attention, by something that operates while you are absent, that holds you when you cannot hold yourself, that gives you back when you could not have given yourself. You have been doing this every night of your life. You have done it tens of thousands of times. The fact that you are reading these words is evidence that the pattern has worked, every time, without exception, since the beginning of your conscious existence. Something has been faithfully returning you to yourself, every morning, for as long as you have been alive. The contemplative traditions invite you to consider what that something is, and to consider what relationship you are in with it, whether you notice or not. It also means that death, the great terror of the surface ego, is not as alien to your experience as it has seemed. You have already lived through, by the most conservative count, more than 10,000 small dissolutions of the integrated self. Each one was, in the experiential terms that matter to the surface ego, a small death. Each one was followed by a return that the surface ego did not author. Whatever death is, finally, when it comes, It is structurally not unlike what has been happening to you every night, with the difference that the return, in death, takes a different form than the return at morning. What that different form is, whether the substrate that has been holding you nightly continues to hold you in some way after the final dissolution of the surface ego, is the question that the world's religious and contemplative traditions have organized themselves to investigate. The answers they have given differ. What they share is the conviction that the question is not as final as the surface ego assumes, and that the daily evidence of sleep is one of the primary places where their convictions are anchored. This is not a promise. It is not an assurance that everything will be all right in some vague sense that the surface ego can take comfort in. It is something more sober and more strange. It is the recognition that the surface ego, the thing whose dissolution is the source of the deepest human anxieties, has been dissolving and being held every night of every life. And the surface ego, being unable to remember what happens during these dissolutions, has formed no relationship to what holds it. It is as if a child were carried home asleep every night by a parent it had never met, and woke each morning with no awareness that any carrying had happened. The daily fact of return is so seamless, so taken for granted, that the question of who or what is doing the returning has, for most people, never even been asked. When you fall asleep tonight, the question becomes available. When you wake up tomorrow, the question becomes available again. You will not solve the question by intellectual analysis alone. The traditions all say that it is solved, to whatever extent it can be solved, by the kind of attention that watches the actual unfolding of the dissolution and the return. The attention does not require special technique. It does not require belief in any particular framework. It requires only the willingness, for a few minutes a day, to look at what is actually happening at the thresholds of consciousness rather than to walk past them unconsciously as you have always done. The person who reads these words tonight will not be the same person who reads them tomorrow morning. The substrate that holds the patterns will work overnight. The synaptic homeostasis will prune and restore. The glymphatic flow will clear what needs clearing. The memory consolidation will edit and integrate. And the integrated self that opens these eyes in the morning will be a reinstantiation, not a continuation. You have crossed this threshold thousands of times. You will cross it tonight. And the question of who crosses, of what is preserved, of what holds you in the gap, of what gives you back to yourself in the morning, is the question that, when finally taken seriously, changes everything else. The traditions promise nothing simple about this. They promise no easy comfort, no cheap consolation, no surface guarantee that your fears were unwarranted. What they offer is something quieter and more demanding. They offer the recognition that what you are is not what you have been assuming, that the deeper layer is real, that the relationship between you and the substrate that holds you is the most fundamental fact of your existence, and that this fact can be lived consciously rather than blindly. They offer the suggestion that the morning is more remarkable than you have ever noticed, that the night is more significant than the surface ego has ever registered, and that the daily cycle of disappearance and return is the most accessible doorway any of us has into the questions that have always been the deepest questions a human being can ask. You are not going to remember most of what you have read here. The reading itself will be consolidated overnight, edited, integrated, partially forgotten. The surface ego that wakes up tomorrow will not have the full content of these inquiries available, but something will have shifted. Something always shifts when attention turns toward what has been overlooked. And the next time you find yourself at the threshold of sleep, you may notice, for the first time, that you are at a threshold. You may register, even briefly, that something is dissolving. You may catch for a moment the actual texture of the descent. And in the morning, you may have a brief impression, before the day's identification fully sets in, that you have just returned from somewhere. From somewhere you cannot remember. From somewhere that has been holding you. From somewhere whose nature, the traditions all suggest, is closer to what you actually are than the surface self you will spend the day being. The person who wakes up is not the person who went to sleep. This is the simple fact that no one notices and no one usually has reason to examine. But it is true. It has always been true. And once you have seen it, the seeing does not go away. Tonight, when you lie down, tomorrow, when you open your eyes, the thresholds will be there. They have been there your whole life. And what crosses them, what holds you in the dark, what gives you back to yourself in the light, has been the most faithful presence in your existence. You did not author the giving. You did not earn the return. You have only ever received it. And the question of what to do with this fact, of how to relate to what holds you, of how to live in awareness of the depth that the surface ego has spent your whole life obscuring, is the question that the rest of your days, however many remain, will be the time you have to answer.